There are many bad ideas about language learning. They often misunderstand what the most robust research says about what methods do work and which methods don't work and why. One of the biggest misconceptions is the belief that by only knowing about a language, one can simply use it better. But it's kind of two different types of knowledge. The knowledge of knowing about something is completely separate from the knowledge of using something. So the fact is that language knowledge can't really be treated the same as other types of knowledge. And because of that, the idea that by simply memorizing vocabulary that you can boost your word power is quite a flawed one. When you compare the amount of effort involved in memorizing language to the amount of memory retention that it actually achieves, it does become clear that by using flashcards, it's just not an efficient use of learner time. This might be hard to accept by a lot of people, but in fact, language learning is an implicit process, meaning that it happens subconsciously without constant focus on learning and focusing on remembering. So when language is being processed for meaning that they're not trying too hard to force themselves to remember isolated pieces of language, and there's lots of context provided that gives life to the language, then learners are able to make connections between the word meaning and the word form. And this process is very similar to how we learn our first language. Children don't learn their first language by memorizing vocabulary and using flashcards. Instead, they construct meaning from the world around them. They hear language in context, they receive lots of input, and they engage with that input. It could be from TV or reading or listening to people speak to them. And normally that input is coming at a level that they're capable of grasping it. They don't consciously, most of the time, think about the meaning of words. The process that I'm describing is the subconscious process, and it is a natural way of learning that leads to lasting memory, because the learning becomes part of their subconscious. So what learners actually need is more input, which is reading and listening materials, that is at the right level for them, and it is supported by enough context to make it understandable. So we might be thinking about video content, we might be thinking about books and other types of listening and reading content. The important point is this: while rote learning, which is memorization, might work for certain types of knowledge, it is very ineffective for language learning. Because in real-time communication, people don't consciously access the part of the brain where memorized knowledge is stored. They use a different part of the brain that is used for communication in real time. And that's where acquired language is stored. So this makes memorization a very low leverage activity for young learners. So input is one of the most important factors for young learners' language development. The more input they get, the better their output becomes. So no input, no output. Those two things are very much interrelated. And the best way to develop this kind of foundation and increase the quality of that input, including vocabulary, is reading for pleasure. Now, by reading for pleasure, what I mean is the learners aren't forced to read anything. They're not forcing themselves to read something too difficult, but they're actually reading something that they're interested in and they actually want to read. And through this process, they encounter high frequency vocabulary in different contexts. And over time, that embedded deeper learning of vocabulary takes place. And this is the longer term strategy that is much more effective than flashcards. This exposure helps them to absorb the language into their subconscious memory and develop their linguistic system, making it long-term. To be effective, the material should be slightly challenging, but also comprehensible. By that, I mean it should be quite below their level in their first language. So they may need to be looking at easier types of books than what they can read in Vietnamese. But it needs to be slightly above their current level of reading ability, comprehension in English. To keep it challenging. So therefore, if they can understand about 50 to 60% of the material, that's actually not bad. That's quite enough. But they should keep reading without stopping to look at every unfamiliar word in the dictionary and just kind of get used to not being able to understand everything. I think the thing that kind of freaks a lot of students out is that they feel like they need to understand every single thing on the page, and that's really not going to help them if they look at it that way. So for students that want to focus on specific vocabulary sets, the best approach is to read or even watch YouTube videos about those specific topics or themes that include those types of words. Because seeing vocabulary in context would ensure that the students are able to understand how those words are actually used, because they're going to see them in relation to the other words in the text and in relation to the other ideas in the text. And they'll see them repeated in different ways. So rather than relying on flashcards and dictionary definitions, because flashcards just result in shallow learning, they rely on a sort of definitions and translations between English and Vietnamese, which might not be accurate or equivalent. Dictionary definitions often fail to convey the meaning of the context of how words are normally used. Many English words as well have multiple meanings, which students might misunderstand or misapply when they're learning them in isolation. I think the important point for the students to understand is that they don't need to know every word. They just need to understand high frequency words that can be useful to them. And I think flashcards might encourage them to cram in more than they can actually, process and be able to use in a realistic context. So while they might find flashcards productive and comforting, they don't really contribute to real progress in learning a language, because of the part of the brain that handles communication doesn't access the part of the brain that actually deals with stored, memorized knowledge. So it doesn't really help them during real life interactions. Students might know the word, but they still are unable to use it effectively. So I think it's crucial to communicate this idea to young learners early. They need to be engaged with language in use, not in memorized isolation. What they really need is input, rich, contextualized exposure to language is the only path to language acquisition. I cannot emphasize this enough.